On the day Mare Vesper finally said it out loud, the old potter's hands went still over the clay, and a sentence he had carried for 3 winters rose behind his teeth, the one he had sworn to a dying man he would never speak. She was on her knees on his studio floor when she said it, a bucket of gray water beside her, a rag gone cold in her fist, and the words tore out of her. No one ever loves a widow with 2 children. The old man turned from his wheel. He had the truth around his neck, a little brass key on a string worn against his chest for 3 years. She had never once noticed it. And tonight, he was going to break a promise to a dead man. He had sworn to the man who gave him that key that he would never use it until she was strong enough to survive what it opened. She was not strong tonight. She was at the bottom of her whole life. By every word of his promise, this was the one night he was forbidden to speak. He spoke anyway, because the truth had been hidden in clay for 3 years, 4 feet from her shoulder, and he could not watch her believe the lie for 1 second longer. He looked at her on the floor and he asked her a question. Not the comfort she braced for, but a question. And the question stopped the breath in her chest and froze her where she knelt, the rag dripping onto the boards. Because the old man already knew the answer. He had known since the first evening she told him her name. Mare Vesper had buried her husband on a Thursday in the rain, and by the following Monday her brother-in-law had begun the long, patient work of teaching her she had married a failure. Ledger Vesper did it gently. That was the part that took her years to see. He never raised his voice. He would sit across from her at the funeral home, then the bank, then the lawyer's office, lower his eyes, shake his head, and say the same soft, terrible thing in a dozen shapes. Wood had left nothing. Wood had been a dreamer. Wood had wasted money on foolish little projects when he should have been thinking of his children. Ledger was sorry, so sorry, but somebody had to be honest with her now that his brother was gone. And who else would do it? She was too broken in those first weeks to argue. Grief takes your legs out from under you. And while she was on the ground, Ledger built the story around her 1 brick at a time. He was the one who handled the hospital bills. He was the one who sorted the mail she could not bear to open. He was the one with the answers, and a woman drowning will hold whatever hand reaches down, even a hand that is holding her under. By the 3rd year, she believed all of it. She kept Wood's photographs in a drawer instead of on the wall, not from grief, from embarrassment. And one evening, her daughter found that drawer. Posey was 6. She had stopped asking what her father had sounded like, because every answer made her mother cry. But that evening Maren came into the bedroom and found the little girl sitting on the floor with the drawer open, holding the photograph against her chest, not crying, not asking, just holding it. And Maren took it from her hands and put it back and shut the drawer and hated herself for the rest of the night. Posey had a small plastic bird she had found at a yard sale, blue, with 1 wing cracked, and she carried it everywhere and would not say why. Maren never asked. She was too tired to ask. That was the kind of tired the 3rd year had made her. The poverty was the kind nobody films. She kept the heat off in every room but the one the children slept in, and she sat in her coat at night to save the bill. She watered the soup so it would stretch to a 2nd night. She counted coins into her palm on the bus before she let herself walk into the store for milk, and twice she put the milk back. Dell was 9, and he had started noticing. He stopped asking for things. A 9-year-old who stops asking for things is a particular kind of heartbreak, and Maren carried it everywhere she went. The debt was the chain. Ledger held a note, $11,000, he said, that Wood had borrowed in his last year. There was no paper she had ever seen, but he reminded her of it whenever she got an idea above her station. And the worst of it came the afternoon she found the courage to ask him, just once, to see the paper. Ledger smiled at her, sad and patient, and glanced toward the children in the next room. Maren, he said, don't make me do this in front of them. And she went silent. She apologized. She never asked again. That was the day she understood, somewhere beneath where she let herself think, that the debt was not really about money at all. If you have ever watched someone you love get made small by a person who calls it kindness, a parent, a sister, a friend, then you already know exactly what kind of man Ledger Vesper was, and this story is for you. Take 1 second to tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. anywhere across the United States, the United Kingdom, or the rest of the world. Because what this woman did with what was waiting for her is going to stay with you. Now, let me take you to the studio. By the third winter, Marin would take any work that paid in cash and hand every dollar of it to Ledger against the note, praying she could chip her way free of him. So when she saw the card taped in the window of the hardware store, an old potter on the riverside of town, looking for someone to clean his studio 3 evenings a week, she copied down the address, put on her dead husband's old coat because it was warmer than her own, and walked the 40 minutes through the cold to reach it. She had no idea whose door she was about to knock on, and no one had sent her. That was the one thing about that winter that was hers, and hers alone, though she would not understand for weeks what it truly was. The building was low brick on the riverside of town, and the man who opened the door was past 70. White hair gone yellow at the edges, hands that looked carved from the same gray stone he worked. He looked at her a beat too long when she said her name. Just a beat. Then he stepped back, told her where the broom was, and that was the beginning of it. What Marin could not have known was that the old man's heart had stopped for the length of that one beat. Because Casper Lund had been waiting 3 years for a woman named Marin Vesper, and he had never once imagined she would simply walk in off the street one evening to answer a card in a window, head down, her husband's name spoken like an apology, with no notion that the man hiring her had been waiting for her the whole time. The studio became the strangest part of her week. Casper barely spoke. He worked at the wheel while she swept, his foot rocking the pedal, shapes rising up out of the spinning clay from nowhere. The kilns held heat in the walls, and for 2 hours, 3 evenings a week, the cold went out of her hands. She brought the children with her. There was no one to leave them with, and they did their schoolwork against the warm wall while she worked. But there was something wrong with the old man, and within a few weeks she had marked it. He watched her, not unkindly, but against the back wall stood a tall oak cabinet with a brass lock, and whenever her cleaning drifted toward it, he found a reason to put himself between her and it. One evening she lifted her rag to dust the top of it, and from inside the cabinet something shifted, a soft wooden knock, like a small object settling against another, and the old man said her name, sharp, the only sharp word he ever gave her. Then he caught himself, and his face changed, and he apologized at once and turned away. But his hands were shaking when he picked his tools back up, and she stood there with her arms still raised, looking at the locked doors, wondering what an old potter could possibly keep that would make him flinch like that. She decided he was lonely and a little strange, as men living alone get. She was wrong. She had no idea how wrong. Her son changed everything, as children will, without ever meaning to. Dell had taken to walking to the studio after school, and one evening Casper set a lump of clay in front of the boy and showed him how to press his thumbs into the center of it. The first 3 things Dell made collapsed. The 4th held, and then the boy did something small. He braced the clay with his right hand and pressed his left thumb into the side of it, low, off to one side, an odd place to put a thumb, and Casper, watching, set his own tool down with a clatter, stood up, walked to the window, and stood there with his back to the room for a long moment before he trusted himself to turn around. Because that was exactly where Wood had pressed his left thumb. The same wrong, particular place. The boy had never seen his father throw a pot in his life. It was simply in his hands. A week later, Dell looked up from the wheel, clay to his wrists, and said the thing that made the old man leave the room. "Mama," the boy said, "this place smells like Daddy's old coat." Marin told him not to be silly, that he barely remembered his daddy's coat. But Casper had already gone into the back, and he did not come out until she called that they were leaving. Then Ledger found the clay under the boy's fingernails. He came by one afternoon to drop off a bag of the children's outgrown clothes he'd collected from the church. Another kindness, performed where neighbors could see it. He took Dell's hand to say hello and stopped. There was gray clay dried deep into the boys' nail beds, days of it. More than one washing had failed to reach. "Where did you get that?" Ledger said, and his voice had gone strange. Dell, who was 9 and proud of it, lit right up. "Mr. Lund's been teaching me, at the pottery studio." "The pottery studio." Ledger repeated the words like they tasted wrong. And then he crouched down to the boy's level, and he smiled, and he said in a voice meant to sound warm, "You stay away from that place, you hear me? That's no place for a boy like you." Marin watched from the doorway, confused, because she had never seen her brother-in-law frightened of anything. And for 1 second, before he smoothed it back over, that was the only word for the look on his face. Frightened. She filed it away without understanding it. She would understand it soon enough. What she still did not know, what the old man carried alone every evening she cleaned his floors, was where her husband had gone on Tuesday afternoons in the last winter of his life. Whit had walked in off the street 3 Octobers before, then in a way Casper recognized, having buried his own wife of a wasting illness 11 years gone. By the second visit, Whit told him the truth. The doctors had given him until spring, and he refused to spend his last good months in a recliner. He had a wife he loved past all sense, and 2 small children, and in 20 years his hands had made that woman nothing. He wanted to leave her one true thing before the time ran out. So they met on Tuesdays. Whit came straight from the cancer floor, gray and shaking. Some weeks, and Casper steadied his wrists over the clay. And Casper, who had stood at his own wife's bedside at the end with a throat full of stone, and never found one word before she was gone, was not only teaching Whit. He was doing, at last, the thing he had failed to do for his own. And as Whit weakened and they both knew he would not live to give the gift himself, he made Casper promise. "Not while she's grieving," Whit said. "Not while my brother has his hands in everything. Ledger will take it, or twist it, the second he knows it's real. Wait until she's standing on her own. Put this in the hands of a woman who still believes she's nothing, and she'll let him take it like he takes everything else. Promise me you'll wait until she's strong." Casper promised. Whit was gone by March, and Casper locked what they had made into the oak cabinet and set out to keep his word, which meant, first, finding her. He mailed a letter to the Vesper house that summer. It came back refused. He mailed another the next spring. It came back too. In the fall, he drove to the house himself, and Ledger met him at the door with a sorrowful, reasonable face and told him Marin had moved away to be near her people, that she wanted nothing connected to Whit, that the kindest thing an old man could do was leave a widow in peace. Casper believed him. Why would he not? So he went home and kept his promise the only way left to him, by guarding the cabinet, by growing old beside it, with no notion on God's earth that the woman he was waiting for lived 20 minutes away, and was sinking month by month into the precise lie Whit had begged him to spare her from. 3 years, and then she walked in off the street to answer a card in a window, and the promise became a trap with no door in it. Every evening she swept his studio with her husband's love locked 4 feet from her shoulder, and by Whit's own rule, a woman who still believed she was nothing was the one woman he could not give it to. So he watched and waited for a strength that never came, and the promise cut deeper every week. It came to a head on a Friday in December, and it came to a head in public, which is the cruelest way for anything to come. There was a luncheon at the church hall. Folding chairs, casserole dishes, a room where everyone knows your business and pretends not to. Marin had not wanted to go. Ledger insisted, framing it as kindness. The children should see people, and he would even cover the small donation at the door, since money was so tight for her. A line pitched to be overheard, and it got worse. Marin was telling another woman, with the first flicker of hope anyone had heard from her in years, that Dell had a gift for pottery, that she had been thinking she might learn the trade herself one day, that there might be something in it for the family. And Ledger laughed. He did not mean it as cruelty, which made it worse. He laughed the indulgent laugh of a reasonable man hearing a foolish child, set his hand on her shoulder in front of the whole table, and said it. "Marin, sweetheart, you're a widow with 2 children, no money, no schooling, and a debt you'll never touch. Nobody hands a woman like you a future. The kindest thing I can say, and I say it because I love my brother, is be grateful for the people willing to put up with you, and stop dreaming about being something you're not." Whit filled his own head with this same nonsense. He spent his last months playing with clay like a child, while I held this family together. Look where his dreaming got him. Look where it got you. The room went still. Somebody's fork touched a plate, and the sound was enormous. Marin sat there with her brother-in-law's hand on her shoulder, and 40 years of her life, folding up small inside her, and she would not cry. Not there, not in front of them. She gathered her children and her coat and walked out into the cold. And her feet took her, without her deciding it, to the one place in the whole frozen city where the cold ever left her hands. Before I open that studio door, subscribe if stories like this are the reason you came here, because what happens on the other side of it is the part people never forget. Now, let me take you inside. Casper was at the wheel when she came in. He saw her face and stopped the wheel with the flat of his hand. The children stood in the doorway, and Marin got as far as the middle of the floor before her legs gave out, and she went down beside the bucket she had left 2 evenings before, and she picked up the cold rag, as if she meant to start cleaning, as if work could hold her together, and instead she broke. She cried the way people cry only when they have run out of every other thing. And out of the middle of it came the sentence the whole night had been driving her toward, the one her brother-in-law had spent 3 years planting in her like a seed. No one ever loves a widow with 2 children. She said it into the floor. She said it like a fact about the world. And the old man went still. For 3 years he had pictured this moment as something else, a woman standing tall, healed, asking for the truth on her own strength. This was the opposite. This was Wit's nightmare made flesh, the woman at the bottom, believing the lie all the way down. By every word of the promise, this was the night he was forbidden to speak. He crossed the floor. His old knees cracked as he crouched in front of her. He waited until she lifted her face, and then he asked it, "Was your husband's name Whit Vesper?" Marin stopped breathing. Of all the things a stranger could have said, of all of them. She stared at the old man and could not make her mouth work, and the silence stretched and filled the warm room, and the children watched, and the kills ticked in the walls. "How?" She got out at last. "How do you know my husband's name?" Casper stood. "He wasn't only a customer, Marin," he said. "He was my friend, the best one I had in 20 years, and he came to me dying." His hands were shaking, as they had shaken the first evening she reached toward the cabinet. He lifted the brass key from the string around his neck, the key she had never noticed, the key he had worn against his chest for 3 years, and he fitted into the lock, and he opened the doors. For a moment, it made no sense to her. Pottery, a shelf of 4 pieces, lit by the single bulb above. Then Casper lifted out the first piece, brought it to her, put it into her 2 hands, and told her to turn it over. It was a bowl, a deep gray bowl, the kind a family eats from every day of its life, and glazed into the inside of it, fired permanently into the clay where no water would ever lift it, in handwriting she would have known in the dark. The handwriting from every birthday card and grocery list of 20 years were the words, "Marin. I did not leave you nothing. I left you my love. It was just unfinished. W." The sound that came out of her was not a word. He did not rush her. He let her hold the bowl until her shaking eased, and then he reached back into the cabinet and gave her the second piece. A small mug, size for a boy's hands, with a single thumbprint pressed into the side of it, the left thumb, low, off to one side, that same odd particular place. "Your husband's thumb," the old man said. He wanted his son to have something his own hand had touched. And Dell, who had pressed his own left thumb into that exact wrong place not 3 weeks before, without ever being shown, came and put his small hand around the mug, and understood, in the way children understand all at once, whose it was. Then the third piece, a clay bird, painted blue. For the little one, Casper said, who was too small to remember his face, so she'd have one thing in the world his hands had made for her. And Posy, 6 years old, who carried a cracked blue plastic bird everywhere and had never told a soul why, took the clay bird in both hands and held it against her chest, exactly as she had held the photograph in the drawer, and did not cry and did not let go. And the fourth piece, a tall, slender vase, lovely and a little strange. This one Whit had not lived to finish. He had meant it for the table, Casper said, for the home, for the suppers and the birthdays and the plain years he already knew he would not get to sit through. A vase to hold flowers in a house he was trying to make sure still had a future. Casper had completed it himself in the weeks after the funeral from the notes his friend left behind, so the gift would be whole. The man who never got to say goodbye to his own wife had finished another man's goodbye for him. He came every Tuesday, Casper told her, while she wept over 20 years of her husband's handwriting. Straight from the hospital. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you watching him get weaker. He wanted to leave you one true thing his own hands had made. And he made me swear I'd wait to give it to you until you were standing on your own. Because he was afraid that if it came to you while you were grieving and surrounded by his brother, it would be taken or turned ugly. I tried to find you, Marin. I wrote twice. I came to the house. Your brother-in-law turned me away and told me you'd moved. I'm an old man, and I kept my friend's promise the best I knew. The old man's voice broke. And tonight you walked in at the lowest I have ever seen a soul, which is the exact night he told me to wait past. But I'm done waiting. He was wrong about one thing, your husband. You don't make a drowning person learn to swim before you throw the rope. Wherever he is, I think he'd forgive me. He had hidden his love in clay, where his brother would never think to look. And it had been here 4 feet from her. Every single night she scrubbed that floor. Marin held the bowl against her chest and rocked, and her children pressed against her, and the studio held all of them in its warmth while the cold pressed at the windows. But the bowl raised a question, and the question had a name. There had been a letter. Casper told her before she thought to ask. Wood had written it in his last week. Casper had watched him seal it, a letter that explained everything, that named the studio and the old potter and the gift waiting in it, that told her where to come when she was ready. And Wood had given it to the one person handling his affairs to make sure it reached her after he was gone. He had given it to his brother. Marin went cold in a new way. In 3 years of being told her husband left her nothing but debt and shame, no one had ever handed her a final letter from a dying man. Sleep never came that night. In the morning, she went to Ledger's house with the bowl wrapped in a dish towel, and she set it on his table, her husband's handwriting facing up, and she watched the reasonable, sorrowful mask come off her brother-in-law's face for the first time in 3 years. He tried the old shape first. He didn't know what she meant. Then, when she said the word letter, he reached for the line he had clearly kept ready for years. I was protecting you, he said. You weren't eating. You weren't sleeping. The children needed a mother, and you could barely stand. Another letter from a dying man. It would have finished what was left of you. I made a judgment. Everything I have done, I did to hold this family together, while my brother was off playing with mud instead of facing what was coming. And Marin, who had spent 3 years small, stood up tall in her brother-in-law's kitchen. You didn't burn it to protect me, she said. You burned it so I'd need you. You spent 3 years teaching me my husband was a failure, so I would never go looking for what he left me. You made me ashamed of the only man who ever loved me. And you did it to a grieving woman, and you used his own children's grief to do it. The debt was never real, was it? There was never any paper. You just needed a leash. For a long moment, Ledger said nothing. And then the truth came out of him, lower than he meant it to, the thing underneath all of it. You were supposed to need me, he said. No, Marin said. I was supposed to grieve. You turned my grief into a leash. Ledger's eyes went to the hallway, to the floor where the children had played on his visits, and he reached for the last card in his hand. And what will you tell them, Marin? That the uncle who fed them and clothed them all these years is a monster. No, she said. I'll tell them their father loved them. And I'll tell them you made sure they didn't know. Ledger had no answer to that. He had finally run out of kindnesses to hide behind, and the silence where his next reasonable sentence should have been was the truest thing he ever gave her. And the debt? The debt died the moment she stopped being afraid of it. There was never any paper, never any proof. Only a frightened woman who believed a confident man. The day she stopped believing him, $11,000 of invented chains simply fell off her wrists and onto his kitchen floor, and he could not pick it back up. But there was one more thing the letter had named, the thing Wood had been reaching toward all along. A small life insurance policy. Wood had kept it paid faithfully into the final month of his life, with Marin as the only beneficiary. The notices had come to Ledger, who handled the paperwork, and Ledger had told her it lapsed. It had not lapsed. The death benefit had been sitting with the company for 3 years, unclaimed, because the only person who could claim it had been told it did not exist. It was not a fortune. It was the size a working man buys when his hands shake at the thought of leaving his family with nothing. enough to put a real floor under them, a floor of her own, so that she would never again have to hand a single dollar to a man like Ledger to keep a roof over her children. That was the point. Not riches. Solid ground. There were no charges. People will argue about that, and I'll let them. Marin decided her children had lost enough family, and that the cleanest revenge on a man like Ledger was to stop needing him, and stop fearing him, and walk out of his kitchen and never come back. So that is what she did. What happened to her after that was no miracle, and it did not come overnight, and that is exactly why it was real. She did not become rich. She became good at something. Casper Lund's hands were beginning to fail him. She had watched him hide the stiffness between pieces. He had no children, no one to leave his life's work to, a craft about to go into the ground with him. So he made her an offer that was not charity, because charity would have insulted what Wit built. He taught her the trade. Year over year. The wheel, the glazes, the kills. And it turned out that the woman who had been told she had no schooling and no future had real hands and a true eye. And in time the sign on the riverside building read Lund and Vesper, and in time it was hers. Dell grew up at that wheel beside her, his father's thumbprint mug on the shelf where he could see it every day. Posey painted the cups. They were not scraping anymore. The suffering had been converted not into a fortune, but into a future, made by her own two hands. Casper never became her husband. The world wants that ending, and the world did not get it, because making the old man into a new love would have cheapened the old one, and neither of them would do it. He became something rarer. He handed her back her husband, and then he left the door open every Tuesday, teaching Dell to center the clay, teaching Posey to paint. A man who had buried his own goodbye years before was, at the end, part of a family again. Years on a cold blue evening, with the kills ticking in the walls of the little house that was finally theirs, Marin set the table and brought out the gray bowl. The real one, the one with his words inside it. Dell, taller now, reached up and took down his thumbprint mug. Posey set the clay bird beside her plate, where it had sat at every supper for years. The cracked plastic one was gone now, boxed away upstairs, replaced at last by the bird her father had made. On the table between them stood the vase, with flowers in it. Marin ran one finger across her husband's handwriting under the glaze. No one spoke. Then she filled the bowl, and her children ate from what their father had made with dying hands, the thing he had been making sure of from a hospital chair, when no one in the world knew where he went on Tuesdays. He had left her everything. He had just hidden it in clay. They told her he left her nothing. But every night, her children ate from his love. Now I want to hear from you, and I want you to pick a side, because this one is not simple. Casper made a promise to a dying man, to wait until Marin was strong before he gave her the gift. And he broke that promise on the worst night of her life, the exact night Wit told him not to. So tell me in the comments, was Casper right to break his promise and give it to her at her lowest moment, or should he have honored Wit's dying wish and waited until she was stronger? Type right or type waited and tell me why. I read every single comment, and I cannot wait to see which side you land on.